Hola a todos. Apologies to my Spanish-speaking viewers for my appalling pronunciation there, but I'm on an aeroplane, well, a virtual one at least, because I'm responding to a request to cover a series of Jack the Ripper-style murders that occurred in Central America in January 1889. However, before I get into that, the captain's just switched on the fasten your seatbelt sign, and we're beginning our descent into Augusto C. Sandino International Airport. So I shall see you when I've cleared customs and immigration. I hope this top hat won't cause any problems. Well, here I am in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, and I'm here to research the story of a series of murders that occurred in January 1889 that was supposedly so brutal that many people believed that Jack the Ripper had left London and resumed his activities in Central America. There had been several crimes in London in November and December 1888 that the press had initially linked to the same person who had carried out the Whitechapel murders. However, the police moved quickly to dispel any notion that these crimes had been carried out by Jack the Ripper, and by January 1889, newspapers the world over were wondering what had happened to the killer. On Wednesday, February the 6th, the New York Sun offered a possible solution to the mystery under the headline, "Is this Jack the Ripper? 6 women murdered and mutilated in Central America. The ways of the Whitechapel murderer imitated in almost every detail, all killed within 2 days, and all depraved." The article read, "Either Jack the Ripper of Whitechapel has emigrated from the scene of his ghastly murders, or he has found one or more imitators in this part of Central America. The people have been greatly aroused by 6 of the most atrocious and ghastly murders ever committed within the limits of this city. The murderer or murderers have vanished as quickly as Jack the Ripper and have left no traces for identification. All of the victims were women of the same character of those who met their fates at the hands of the London murderer. Like those women of Whitechapel, they were women who had sunk to the lowest degradations of their calling. They have been found murdered just as mysteriously, and the evidences point to almost identical methods. 2 were found butchered out of all recognition. Even their faces were most horribly slashed, and in the case of all the others, their persons were frightfully disfigured. There is no doubt but that a sharp instrument, violently but dexterously used, was the weapon that sent the poor creatures out of the world. Like Jack the Ripper's victims, they have been found in out-of-the-way places, 3 of them in the suburbs of the town and the others in dark alleys and corners. 2 of the victims were found with gaudy jewellery, and from this it is urged that the mysterious murderer has not committed the crimes for robbery. In the case of the other 4, a few coins were found on their persons, representing, no doubt, the prospective consideration from the murderer or murderers. All of the victims were in the last stages of shabbiness and besottedness. In fact, in almost every detail, the crimes and the characteristics are identical with the Whitechapel horrors. All of the murders occurred in less than 10 days, and as yet the perpetrator or perpetrators have not been apprehended. Every effort is being made to bring him or them to justice. The authorities have been stimulated in their efforts by the statement which seems to be generally accepted that Jack the Ripper must have emigrated to Central America and selected this city for his temporary abode. Over the next few weeks, the Sun story was picked up by newspapers all over Britain, and several of them published a syndicated article that suggested that the killer had left London as long ago as November 1888 and had made his way to Nicaragua via Jamaica, where he had stopped off to perform a similar series of atrocities. The Fife Herald published details of the Jamaica atrocities in its edition of Wednesday the 13th of February 1889. The crews of various steamers plying between New York and Kingston, Jamaica, are telling fearful stories of crimes committed in Spanish Town, a village near Kingston, which to their minds unquestionably indicate that Jack the Ripper has gone from England to Jamaica. The first of a series of diabolical and mysterious murders took place on the 28th of November 1888 in St. Catherine's Parish, a few miles distant from Spanish Town. The victim was a woman of the lowest and most vicious class, whose name has never been discovered. She was found early in the morning, lying by the roadside, her throat cut from ear to ear, her cheeks, nose and forehead slashed in a manner that would indicate it to be the work of a skillful butcher. The body was mutilated exactly as had been done in the London cases. If anything further had been needed to make the horror-stricken crowd attribute the crime to the Whitechapel murderer, it was found on a card pinned to the unfortunate woman's body by the blade of a small penknife. The card bore this inscription: "Jack the Ripper, 14 more, then I quit." On the morning of the 13th of December, in a field, lying by and partially concealed under an old shed, was found a second body. In this case, the woman was a notorious creature of the lowest class called Mag. Her wounds were of the same nature as those inflicted upon the other. The field in which the corpse was discovered was scarcely a mile distant from the scene of the first murder. The authorities made a hurried investigation and buried the body as speedily as possible, giving no one an opportunity to examine it. No mention of the crimes was made in the newspapers at the time, the officials endeavouring by every means in their power to hush the matter up and have it talked about as little as possible. No trace was ever found of the murderer, and it was forgotten save by a few of the wretched women who belonged to that class, among which the unfortunates moved. The third body was found on the Friday before New Year's Day. This time the newspapers were compelled to notice the discovery. The scene of this third murder was about midway between the places where the former discoveries had been made, and the sailors insist that the crime was in every way analogous to the others. On Monday the 18th of February, the Pall Mall Gazette linked the murders in Nicaragua to the murders in Jamaica and suggested they offered a possible clue to the perpetrator's identity. Jack the Ripper. 6 mutilations in Nicaragua. Several murders in Jamaica. A possible clue to his identity. It would seem from the intelligence published this morning that Jack the Ripper has transferred himself from the old world to the new and is practicing his horrible crimes with as much impunity in the far west as he did in the east of London. Some time ago it was reported that some unknown criminal had perpetrated several murders of the well-known Whitechapel type upon the outcast women in Jamaica. It will be seen from the paragraph which we quote from the New York Sun that a similar outbreak of crime has occurred in Nicaragua. The suggestion is obvious. When the Whitechapel murders were in progress, a correspondent in Manchester sent to us an ingenious theory of the murders. He suggested that the murders and mutilations were in all probability performed by a ship's cook on one of the steamers plying to and fro from the port of London. The last Whitechapel murder was committed on Lord Mayor's Day, November the 9th, since which time there have been no similar murders in the east of London. We now learn that at the beginning of January, similar atrocities were taking place in Nicaragua, and that about the end of December, equally barbarous mutilations are reported from Jamaica. It would be interesting to know whether any steamer left the Thames after the 9th of November and after calling at Jamaica in December proceeded to Central America. If such a steamer exists, there seems a strong probability that the murderer will be found among her crew. At any rate, the clue is one that might well be followed up by our detectives. It transpired that the supposed murder spree in Jamaica was in fact just one murder, that of Estina Crawford on Friday the 28th of December 1888, and far from being an unsolved crime, Benjamin Ranger had been hanged for it on the morning of Tuesday the 5th of February 1889. Tellingly, despite the fact that the murder and the execution of the perpetrator had been reported in America, the British press opted not to give it any coverage other than to hint at it in the article about Jack the Ripper having crossed 4,568 miles to Jamaica. Aside from that, the whole Jamaican story was a fabrication. But surely the Nicaragua murders actually happened. I mean, the Victorian newspapers wouldn't be so bold as to publish details of further murders that never occurred. Would they? Well, sadly, this would appear to have been the case, albeit if an article that appeared in the American newspaper, the Mitchell Daily Republican, is to be believed, the papers had in fact been caught out by an elaborate ploy orchestrated by the detectives at Scotland Yard aimed at instilling a false sense of security into the Whitechapel murderer in order to lure him from his hiding place, presumably so he would strike again and they could bring him to justice. The article read, "There is reason to believe that the intermittent stories of real or attempted outrages of a similar character in various parts of the world since the latest East End horror were really put in circulation by Scotland Yard detectives, presumably with the strategical idea, which cannot fail to awaken admiration for its brilliancy, of lulling to sleep the vigilance of the real monster and tempting him to add another to his list of victims. The reported outrages in Central America really appear to have been of this kind, and if their promulgation was truly due to the ingenuity of the inspectors here, it reflects some credit on their powers of invention." So in other words, if the article in The Republican is to be believed, the supposed Ripper murders in Jamaica and Managua were part of an elaborate hoax perpetrated by the Metropolitan Police that was intended to help them in their endeavours to catch Jack the Ripper. And newspapers in both Britain and America fell for it hook, line and sinker, not to mention yours truly, who's just flown 5,395 miles to investigate it. Of course, it is noticeable that the papers were very vague in their details about the crimes. No victims' names were given, for example, and there's also the possibility that the papers were in on the ruse and simply played along with it by publishing details of the fictitious atrocities. What seems likelier, however, is that the newspapers, desperate for stories about the fate of the Whitechapel murderer, got wind of a gruesome killing in Jamaica, and from the sparse details they had of it, wove it into a sensational, though completely untrue story, in which Jack the Ripper had resumed his atrocities in the New World. And if that disappoints you, how do you think I feel, having travelled all the way to Managua to hunt for a killer that never existed? I'm going back to dear old Blighty.